Have you ever walked into a place and for a moment had the strange sensation of something shifting, as if the walls had moved when you blinked? I swear that hallway wasn't there when we arrived. The rain was falling lightly, dripping onto the roof of the car like a silent drum, and the neon sign for the Silver Pine Motel blinked a tired red, illuminating the wet asphalt. Route 66 was practically deserted that night, and all I wanted was to find a cheap, minimally comfortable place to spend a few hours. My daughter and I had been on the road longer than was safe, and the weight of sleep mixed with a tiredness that wasn't just physical. The reception area smelled of mildew and damp wood, and the man behind the counter seemed to speak more slowly than usual, as if each word had to pass through an invisible fog before reaching me. I was handed the metal key engraved with the number 7, and the hallway leading to our room seemed longer than it should have been. The yellowish light flickered in the lamps, casting shadows that stretched across the walls and disappeared when I tried to focus on them. As we walked, I felt something strange, as if the air inside was heavier than outside. My daughter, holding my hand tightly, didn't say anything, but I noticed the way she looked both ways, as if trying to memorize the way back. Have you ever experienced this? That nagging feeling that you need to remember every detail, as if it were important to survive. The room, from the outside, looked like just another room. Worn wooden door, loose latch, peeling paint. Inside it was simple and cold, but adequate for what we needed. I convinced myself the silence was a relief, but the truth was, it bothered me. Outside, the rain was getting heavier, and a steady wind made the metal parking lot signs creak. I knew I shouldn't care, but that hallway, there was something about it that didn't quite fit. My daughter fell asleep quickly, but sleep came slowly to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I heard footsteps outside, slow and rhythmic, coming and going as if someone were measuring the space. When I finally decided to get up to check, I noticed that the bedroom door seemed to be at a different angle. It may sound crazy, but even the doorknob felt colder than before, as if I'd spent the entire night exposed to the draft. I opened the door and took 2 steps outside. That's when I noticed the hallway wasn't the same. The floor, the lighting, even the distance between the doors, everything seemed wrong. And most disturbingly, when I tried to look at the end of it, it seemed like my perspective stretched, like some kind of cursed mirror trick. There was no sound of other guests, not even the noise of the reception desk in the background, only a piercing silence that seemed to close in around me. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because that night, in that cheap motel lost on Route 66, it wasn't just the hallway that was shifting. And as I stood there trying to figure out what was happening, I had the feeling we weren't alone. Stay with me until the end, because from that moment on, every step we took us deeper into a place we weren't sure we'd ever escape. And that's how it all began. I stood there, standing in the doorway, feeling the cold air creep down the hallway as if it came from a place that hadn't existed seconds before. The floor creaked beneath my feet, even when I wasn't moving. The light above flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to writhe against the wall. It wasn't just a hallway. It was as if the motel itself was alive, changing to confuse us. And this is where I need to open a parenthesis with you, who are listening now. If you've ever felt like a place was wrong, as if it were trying to expel you or trap you in some way, leave your experience in the comments below. I read every story you share, and it's no exaggeration to say that they often help shape future stories. Your experience can add new pieces to this puzzle we're putting together, and if this atmosphere has already touched you, if this story has given you that strange feeling in the back of your neck, give it a like now. It seems like a small gesture, but it's what keeps this channel alive, allowing me to continue bringing you stories like this for you to immerse yourself in. And if you're not yet a subscriber, take the opportunity to do so. That way, you won't miss anything that's coming. And believe me, what's about to happen goes far beyond what I've told you so far. The strangest thing is that As I took deep breaths to try to calm myself, I had the sensation that the hallway was watching me back. There were no eyes, no face, but it was as if every inch of that space knew exactly where I was. And that's when I noticed something that shouldn't have been there in the far corner. I was still standing there in the doorway, trying to understand why the hallway seemed different, when a distant thunder made the glass tremble slightly. I turned my gaze back into the room. My daughter was asleep, her face relaxed, hugging the coat I'd left on the bed. Her breathing was even, but there was something about the room that prevented me from feeling the same. I closed the door slowly, as if a sudden gesture might draw attention to something I couldn't yet see. The truth is, that night wasn't in our plans. We'd left Flagstaff, Arizona right after lunch, and the idea was to reach Albuquerque, New Mexico before midnight. But the road seemed endless. The damp asphalt reflected our headlights in streaks that moved like liquid shadows, and the light rain that had begun in the early afternoon became a thicker curtain as we crossed small, uninhabited stretches. The longer I drove, the more I felt the weight of the journey. My shoulders burned, my eyes began to sting, and that straight line on the horizon seemed to mock me. That's why, when I saw the flashing Silver Pine Motel sign, I made the immediate decision to stop. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. We needed a break, and not just to sleep. This trip, deep down, was more than just getting from one point to another. It was an attempt to rebuild something. My daughter and I have been through a difficult period in recent years, and conversations between us have become rare, replaced by long silences that carry more weight than any argument. In the car, before stopping at the motel, there were moments when the radio was the only sound, and others when not even music could fill the void. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to find some trace of the talkative girl who once filled me with made-up stories and questions about everything. But she, now 13, seemed to be somewhere else, even sitting less than a meter away from me. It wasn't indifference. It was as if there were an invisible wall between us, a wall built with small hurts, misunderstandings, and things left unsaid. That night, as I parked in front of room number 7, I imagined that perhaps the pause might open up some space for conversation. But looking back now, I think it was at that moment that fate decided this story wouldn't just be about the two of us. The world around us had plans of its own, too, plans beyond our decisions or our mindsets. It's strange to think about, but some places seem to carry a kind of memory, as if everything that ever happened there is trapped in the walls, waiting for the next visitor to reveal itself. As we unloaded our bags, I noticed her watching me curiously. It wasn't fear, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel like we were about to enter unfamiliar territory. And I'm not just talking about the motel. I'm talking about this journey that blends the physical and the emotional, the concrete and the invisible. It's as if suddenly, every step you take is also a step into yourself, where the parts you avoid facing are kept hidden. The rain was relentless, and that hallway seemed longer each time I mentally walked through it. Maybe it was just exhaustion, but I felt every detail: the muffled sound of the raindrops, the smell of wet wood, the subtle creak of the floor was etched in a way that would forever be part of our memories. In that instant, I realized this wouldn't be just another rest stop. Something there was going to transform us, and there was no telling whether it would be for better or worse. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because deep down, this story didn't begin the moment we opened the bedroom door. It began much earlier, in the silent decisions, the averted glances, and the hidden truths we carried without saying aloud. And when you carry this kind of invisible baggage, any place with a strange energy can act as a distorted mirror, reflecting what you fear most, or what you most want to forget. Comment there. That makes sense to me. The road that night seemed endless. The rain was no longer a thin curtain merely blurring the vision. It was now falling more heavily, making the windshield wipers work at an almost hypnotic rhythm. I drove slowly, attentive to the shiny asphalt, while the car's headlights projected ahead like two cones of light cutting through an endless void. Along the highway, old signs appeared and disappeared in the gloom, some with burned-out bulbs, others flickering erratically as if struggling to stay lit. They were advertisements for abandoned gas stations, restaurants that looked closed for decades, and motels with promises of free Wi-Fi and breakfast included that sounded more like relics of a bygone era than actual amenities. It was amidst this scenery that I spotted, almost as an afterthought, the Silver Pine Motel sign. The red and green neon sign flickered slowly, like a tired heart beating out of rhythm. Half of the letters seemed to flicker from time to time, rendering the name illegible for seconds. The sign was flanked by two tall, thin pine trees, which swayed in the wind, casting long shadows over the parking lot. Perhaps it was the effects of exhaustion or the way the light reflected off the water pooled on the asphalt. But there was something about that entrance that felt out of place, as if it didn't quite belong on that stretch of road. I hesitated for a moment before turning the wheel. Part of me wanted to keep going, ignore the urge to stop, but another part knew it wasn't safe to continue. Fatigue was already seeping into my reflexes, and I could feel that heaviness behind my eyes that precedes blackouts at the wheel. So I made the decision. I crossed the narrow driveway and parked in front of room number 7 in an open spot right in front of the door. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for an old sedan of nondescript color parked near the reception area. Its windows were so fogged up it was impossible to tell if anyone was inside. I turned off the car and the engine stopped, giving way to the steady patter of rain falling on the metal roof covering part of the facade. I walked to the reception area with my daughter by my side. The glass door was slightly stuck, and when I pushed it open, I was greeted by heavy, damp air, with a strong, musty smell mixed with the stale odor of old carpet. The room was small, lit by a single lamp with a yellowed shade. On the counter, a rusty brass bell reflected the light faintly. The man who appeared inside seemed to have stepped out of a bygone era. He wore a worn flannel shirt, a thin beard, and eyes that took a few seconds to focus on the speaker. He greeted us with a curt, unsmiling wave, as if the mere presence of guests were a routine, unimportant detail. I asked for a room for the night, and he disappeared for a few seconds, returning with a metal key attached to a wooden keychain, hand engraved with the number 7, the paint already peeling at the edges. As I filled out the registration form, I noticed something curious. Behind it, a wall was covered in old black and white photographs. Most showed the motel from different angles, but in all of them, there was something that bothered me. In some, the hallways seemed longer. In others, the doors were in different positions. None of the images were dated, and when I asked about them, the man simply replied that the place has changed a lot over time, and looked away at the rain outside. The humidity in the reception area was so thick, it felt like it was sticking to my skin. My daughter stayed close, her eyes scanning the room, as if trying to absorb every detail. I took the key, nodded my thanks, and we walked back the way we came to the car. The neon light blinked again, and for a moment, it seemed like the blinking sequence formed an almost intentional pattern, like a code trying to be transmitted. As we loaded our bags into the room, the strangeness persisted. The reception, the lighting, the sign, everything gave the impression that this motel held more history than it seemed, and perhaps not all of it was something worth exploring. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely in these places forgotten by the rush of the world that hidden truths lurk, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves to those who dare stop. My daughter and I crossed the soggy parking lot, each step sounding distinct, as if the ground registered our arrival with a rhythm that clashed with the rain. The reception door closed, behind us with a weary sigh, and the man at the desk took a few seconds to look up, as if waking from an old thought. He didn't smile, didn't ask where we were from. He simply held out his clipboard and waited, motionless, his gaze lost somewhere between my face and the yellowed lampshade. The pen felt heavier than it should have. I filled in the information, and as I wrote, he disappeared through a side door and returned with the key. Cold, heavy metal attached to a worn wooden rectangle with the number 7 hand-painted on it. The paint was peeling at the edges, as if time had decided to gnaw at the corners first. When the key touched the counter, it rang with a jingle that vibrated in my head for longer than usual. "Room 7, park in front," he said without really looking at me. His voice was unhurried. It was as if each syllable needed to overcome a certain air resistance to exist. My daughter moved a little closer, as if seeking warmth, but inside, the humidity ruled everything. The musty smell came from the carpet and curtains, and it seemed as if the wood of the walls were breathing along with it, swollen, reminiscent of a basement that never sees sunlight. To the right of the counter, a mural of old photographs insisted on capturing my attention. The Silver Pine Motel in different eras, but with details that didn't match. A longer hallway angle, a set of doors that seemed to switch sides, a sign with whole letters in one photo and broken letters in another. I tried to find dates. There were none. I asked how long the motel had been in existence. "Long enough," he replied, and that was it. I left with the key in my hand, and the cold wind hit my face like a warning. The space in front of the room was indeed free, a perfect rectangle of wet asphalt reflecting the marquee lights. The door to the 7th floor had dark green paint repainted over old layers, a relief of brushstrokes that created small waves when the light passed through. I inserted the key. The doorknob gave with a dry click, and the smell from inside came first. Old soap dust, something metallic deep inside, as if the air had the memory of stagnant water. I turned on the light. The room was simple, but the layout was meticulous. 2 beds, a rough textured ivory bedspread, a side table with an outdated guide to local restaurants, and a thin-screen television on an antique dresser that didn't quite match. The heavy curtains barely kept out the light from the sign outside, which entered in red pulses, as if the room breathed to the cadence of neon. The heater released a warm, humid breeze that brushed against my skin and lingered. My daughter set her backpack on the chair and ran her fingers along the tabletop, as if testing reality with a small gesture. "Is everything okay?" I asked, not quite brave enough to hear the answer. She nodded, but there was a question hidden behind that movement. I went to the bathroom. White tiles with vein-like cracks, a mirror with a stain on the bottom corner, a shower that leaked a drop every 2 seconds. The kind of scene that on any other night would be just that, a quick stop, a rest, and that's it. But here, every detail seemed to mean something else. I returned to the room and looked out the window. The fogged-up sedan sat in the same spot, quiet, like an animal that had learned to wait. Across the courtyard, a hallway light flickered and stopped, as if it had changed its mind. When I decided to take the signed form back to reception, my daughter said she'd stay in her room. "I'll lock the door," she assured me, and I believed her. I crossed the marquee, and it was then that I noticed that the hallway to the left, the same one we'd passed 2 minutes earlier, seemed a little longer. Not much, just enough to give the feeling that something had moved while you weren't looking. Vinyl floors, paneled walls that rose halfway, from their cream paint. I looked twice, mentally measuring the distance between the doors. Number 5 seemed farther away than I remembered. Maybe it was just the light. Maybe it was fatigue. The brain learns to negotiate with unfamiliarity when we need to move forward. The receptionist was in the same spot, only now he was staring at a small TV with a low hiss, like a poorly tuned radio. I handed him the sheet. He said, "Thank you," and for the first time, he looked up completely. There was an old weariness in his eyes, but it wasn't just that. It was a kind of practiced neutrality, like someone who'd seen too many versions of the same night. I asked if the soda machine was still working. "Whenever," he replied. "Maybe today." The sentence was delivered with a kind of laugh-free humor, and I was sure it was his way of saying good luck without needing to wish anything. On the way back, the rain eased to a drizzle that seemed to walk with me. And again, the hallway. I can't explain it. It felt like perspective had taken a step back and another to the side. Nothing blatant, nothing I could photograph and prove, but the body senses it. It's like entering a room where someone had just argued. There's no voice, no fight, but the air retains the shape of the conflict. I touched the wall, as if the texture could tell me something. The wood gave off a chill that didn't match the heater being on. I opened the bedroom door, and my daughter was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at me like she wanted to be strong but preferred not to hide it. "Did you hear?" she asked, almost whispering. I stood still for a second. "Heard what?" She pointed to the wall shared with the neighboring room. Footsteps, coming and going, slow, stopping right here. Her finger marked a spot on the baseboard, and I felt a chill that wasn't coming from the weather. I put my ear to it. Nothing, just the electric hum of the lamp. I was about to say something comforting, the kind of phrase practiced for adults who need children to sleep, when the hallway made a different noise, as if the ceiling had moved an inch. It wasn't loud, it was precise. The television turned on by itself. Blue screen, no channel. I pressed the remote, turned it off, turned it on. The sound insisted on staying at volume 3, even when I tried to turn it to 5. Little things. It's funny how little things become proof when you don't want to believe the rest. I sat next to her, and her breathing adjusted to mine, an old mirror trying to recalibrate the image. "Maybe it's the plumbing," I said, knowing I didn't believe my own explanation. "Maybe," she replied non-committally. "Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the first contact with a place isn't just what we see, it's what we allow ourselves to feel. The mindset with which you enter determines what the space gives back. When you're carrying unresolved decisions, pent-up silences, it senses it. Places like this, cheap, forgotten on the edges of Route 66, have layers that function like backstage in an old theater. The sets may change, but something always remains behind the curtain. The hidden truth resides in those details we almost overlook. A crooked number on the door, a frame that's not quite centered, a light that flickers at the same point in a sentence. And if the impact isn't immediate, it comes later, when you're about to fall asleep and the room is quieter than it should be. I lay down for a few minutes just to trick my body, but it wouldn't let itself be fooled. Each time I closed my eyes, the sign outside flickered beneath my eyelids, marking its own time. Then I heard the sound of the soda machine outside, spitting out a can with a metallic clang. There was no one in the hallway. The can rolled a few inches, stopped, and silence settled back into the walls. I got up slowly to check the door lock, and the handle gave a small jump, as if it had a very discreet life. My heart raced. I could have sworn we'd locked it. Had we? My memory brushed against a void, and for a second, my thoughts were stuck. There, in a fissure between gesture and certainty, I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to mentally map out the motel corridor by corridor. The mind does that when it doesn't trust its eyes. It constructs its own map, but every time I reached the end of the hallway outside, it stretched a little further, with a bend that hadn't existed before. It was like walking in dreams, and, as in dreams, logic insisted on failing me just when I needed it. My daughter fell asleep first, her face turned to the wall, her hand clenched tightly under the pillow. Time then slowed down, and I listened to what there was to hear. It happened like this: one step, then another, then a long pause, as if someone were deciding, and finally a shuffle, light, almost a timid gesture. I approached the door and pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway stretched straight, empty, lit by lamps that insisted on dying slowly. The number 6 in the next room seemed slightly tilted, as if the screw had given up its work. There was no one there. Even so, the sense of presence settled in the room with the naturalness of something that knows its way. I took a deep breath, and it returned with a taste of iron, as if the air had passed through a rusty place before reaching me. Behind me, the television crackled. I whipped around. The screen remained black, but there was a reflection in it. My shoulder, the bed, the door. And for a moment, I swear I saw in the reflection a shadow where no one was. I turned off the TV. The shadow vanished. The hallway outside made the noise again, that slight adjustment I already recognized as my own. And yet, it was only the beginning. Right there. I'm on this journey too. I closed the door carefully, trying not to make a sound, as if the air itself was paying attention to my movements. The suitcases were leaning against the wall, still closed, and my daughter sat up in bed automatically, as if trying to create a safe zone for herself. The steady sound of the rain mixed with the low hum of the heater, creating a background noise that seemed to come from far away, as if transmitted through a wall that was too thick. I was about to open the suitcase when she called out to me, her voice not of fear, but of discomfort. "Dad, the hallway outside, it's not the same, is it?" I looked at her, and the weight of that sentence sank straight into my stomach. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect from someone seeing everything for the first time. I decided to check. I turned the handle, opened the door, and was met with something that didn't make sense. The hallway in front of us didn't lead back to the reception, as it had minutes before. Now it opened to a different angle, pointing to a window at the end where a side door had once been, and yet the structure looked identical. Same paint, same light fixtures, same worn carpet, except the exit we'd used had simply disappeared. I stood there for a few seconds, staring as if I could find the explanation for that change in the air. I wanted to believe I was just too tired, that I'd gotten confused, but the truth is, my body knew, and the body doesn't fool itself with that kind of thing. I closed the door and took a deep breath, trying to hide it. I didn't want my daughter to see how much this was affecting me. It was then that I noticed another detail, so banal it might have gone unnoticed. The bedroom clock, a tabletop model with large numerals, read 9:14 a.m. I knew this wasn't right. I checked my phone, 11:14 a.m., exactly 2 hours off. The clock wasn't stopped. The second hand was spinning normally. It was just slow, and it wasn't days late, like someone forgot to adjust it. It was a calculated, precise delay, as if someone had deliberately turned the dial. This realization brought me a discomfort that wasn't logical but profound, because time for us is like an invisible track. If it changes even slightly, our mind loses its bearings, and anything can happen. I felt that the delay wasn't a technical error but a choice, and that choice said something about the place we were in. Maybe it was just coincidence, maybe not. But in the context of that motel, nothing seemed to be just one thing. My daughter glanced at her watch too, and I saw the same uneasiness in her eyes. We didn't need to talk about it. It was there, hovering, like the humidity that had accompanied us since we walked in, the time difference, the change in the hallway, too. Seemingly small signs that open doors to bigger questions, because the truth is, when the first strange signs appear, it's not like in the movies with screams and slamming doors. They come like this, silent, subtle, easy to ignore if you really want to believe everything is okay. But I've learned in other situations in life that ignoring signs is a dangerous decision. And I'm not just talking about motels or empty roads. In our personal journeys, these signs arise all the time. A conversation that changes tone, a detail that doesn't fit, a delay that shouldn't be there. The mindset of those who pay attention to these small cracks is different. It's the mindset of those who understand that the real impact of things doesn't happen explosively, but builds little by little until it's impossible to go back to the starting point. Noticing these signs requires more than attention. It requires accepting that once you see them, you can't pretend you didn't see them. And this changes the course of the decisions that come later. There, in that cheap room at the Silver Pine Motel, The difference between the hallway we remembered and the one before us was more than architectural. It was as if the space itself was testing our perception, asking us how far we would go before admitting something was wrong. And when time starts moving differently, even if only 2 hours late, it's impossible not to wonder, wrong for whom? The rain outside was beginning to change tone. Before, it had been a constant, almost soothing backdrop, but now it pounded harder on the metal roof of the marquee, producing a deep sound, almost like drums being played in the distance. The heavier drops ran down the bedroom window in lines that joined and separated, forming strange patterns, as if trying to write something that disappeared before it could be read. With each flash of lightning, the room filled with a pale, sudden light, revealing for a split second a space colder than I remembered. And the thunder, though distant, carried that kind of resonance that seems to spread throughout the body, vibrating in the bones. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, looking at the late clock, when I noticed the sound. At first, I thought it was water running down a gutter, but no. There was a rhythm, irregular and human, footsteps, slow, shuffled, as if someone outside was moving unhurriedly, their heels dragging against the hallway carpet. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It wasn't the steady tread of a guest going to their room. It was hesitant, almost observant. I got up and walked to the door. I put my ear to it, and the sound became clearer. Step, shuffle, step, shuffle. My hands felt cold, and I realized I was gripping the doorknob as if I needed a steadying point to keep my balance. I looked under the door. There was no shadow, but that didn't mean anything. With the carpet so worn, it was hard to see anything. There, my daughter heard it too. She was lying down, but she lifted her head and gave me a look that needed no words. The sound repeated again, this time with a longer pause, as if the person had stopped right in front of our door. We stood still. The silence lasted long enough for me to begin to doubt I'd actually heard anything, and then a nearby thunderclap crashed, drowning out all other noise. As the noise from the sky faded, I realized the atmosphere in the room had changed. It was as if the air had become denser, more charged, as happens before a major storm. Only the storm was already there, and what I felt wasn't the weather, it was something else, a presence. That kind of perception that can't be explained logically, but which the body recognizes instinctively. I sat back down, trying to convince myself they were just other guests, but a part of me already knew otherwise. The rhythm of those footsteps wasn't that of someone going anywhere. It was that of someone wanting to be heard, and there was no rush, as if time was different for those outside. Maybe it was. The rain picked up and the wind began to batter the building's structure, making the wood creak in places. The lampshade flickered once, as if tired, but held firm. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to reorganize my thoughts. But instead of clarity, an unwanted memory surfaced. I'd felt something similar before, years ago, somewhere else, when I realized I was being watched, without knowing by whom. The difference was that time, I could walk away. There are times when the environment around you seems to align to convey a single message, and it comes not in words, but in sensations. It's the kind of communication that doesn't ask your permission to happen. It simply settles in, as if it's always been there, waiting for you to be vulnerable enough to notice. And it's at this point that the line between what's physical and what's psychological begins to blur. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts, until my daughter broke the tension with a simple question. Is there a soda machine here? I knew I'd seen one on my first visit to reception near a side door. The idea of leaving the room, getting some air, and perhaps dispelling the oppressive atmosphere sounded like a good plan. I took out my wallet, handed her a bill, and said, "Come on, you choose whatever you want." We opened the door together. The hallway was lit, but the light seemed dimmer, as if the energy had drained a bit since we'd last seen it. The smell of damp was stronger, and the air felt heavier, like it does in old basements where time doesn't move the same way. I took a few steps and noticed something that made me stop. The hallway seemed narrower. It wasn't a huge difference, but enough that our shoulders would almost brush the wall if we walked side by side. I glanced back as if to compare the width of our bedroom door with the space around it, but the feeling only grew. We kept walking, and each step seemed to echo strangely, as if the sound were swallowed before it reached its end. The doors lined up, but the numbering seemed off, as if the numbers had been switched around. Within seconds, we reached the spot where, in my memory, the soda fountain should have been, but it wasn't. In its place was just a small, built-in cabinet, painted the same color as the walls, the paint peeling around the edges. I knew I wasn't wrong. I'd seen the machine before, the red metal body, the internal light glowing, illuminating the cans. Now, nothing. An empty space that seemed to have never served any purpose. I looked at my daughter, expecting her to say she remembered it too, but she just frowned. I thought this was it. She ran her hand along the wall as if searching for a crack or some sign that something had been moved. There were no marks, no scratches, no difference in the paint color. It was as if the machine had never existed. We decided to move on, hoping to find her somewhere else, but the hallway seemed to stretch on in a way that made no sense. I'd walked this way before. I clearly remembered the distance to the side door. Now, each new turn seemed to lead us to another identical section, repeating the same sequence of doors and walls. There was no sound of other guests, nor of televisions playing behind the closed doors. Only the soft sound of the carpet beneath our footsteps, and in the distance, the rain beating down on the roof. After a few minutes, my daughter grabbed my hand. The gesture was so sudden that I realized how tense she was. "I think we should go back," she said. I wanted to insist, to tell her it was nonsense, but the truth was, her uneasiness mirrored my own. When we turned to go back, the hallway behind us felt different, not so much in structure, but in feel, as if we had entered it for the first time. The doors were all closed, but there was a thick, almost physical silence that hadn't been there before. I quickened my pace, guiding her back, but at every turn I had the strange sensation we were passing through the same place twice, as if we were circling a maze that from the outside looked like just a simple hallway. When we finally spotted the door to our room, I felt a relief I didn't want to admit. We entered quickly, and before I could even lock the door, my daughter was already sitting up in bed, staring at the floor as if trying to process what had just happened. Because there are moments in life when things don't truly disappear, they just shift, and we're forced to decide whether to keep searching or to accept the new reality that presents itself. This seemingly simple choice carries enormous impact because it defines our relationship with truth. At the Silver Pine Motel, the truth seemed to be playing hide and seek, and every time we tried to find it, it took us further than we were prepared to go. When we closed the door behind us, the room looked the same, but the feeling wasn't. It was as if we'd brought something back with us from the hallway, a weight, an invisible presence that settled in the air, making each breath a little more difficult. My daughter was quiet for a while, but I knew she was fighting the urge to speak, until without looking at me, she whispered, "I feel like someone's looking at us." The sentence hung between us, heavy and direct. There was no way to respond in a way that would be comforting without lying. Instinct told me to say it was just her impression, but I felt it too, not like a physical gaze coming from a specific point, but as if the room itself had eyes. And that's worse, because there's no turning your back on something that's everywhere at once. I moved closer to the window to try to dispel the feeling, but outside, the rain had intensified even more. The Silver Pine Motel sign blinked in an irregular pattern, scattering red flashes across the glass. That was when the first flicker of the interior lights occurred, quick like the blink of an eye. The second came soon after, this time longer, plunging the room into an uncomfortable gloom. The sound of the rain seemed louder in the darkness, and a dull crack echoed off the ceiling, as if something had moved overhead. When the lights came back on, it wasn't the same room we'd found. At least, not exactly. It took me a few seconds to understand what was different, until I realized the door was no longer in the same place. Where it had previously been flush with the bed, it now seemed shifted to the right, almost touching the closet. I took a few slow steps, trying to process it, and the longer I looked, the more certain I became that it wasn't just a trick of perspective. The wall where the door should have been was now smooth, continuous, with no sign of having once housed an entrance. And the new door didn't look new. It had the same dark green paint, the same marks on the frame, as if it had always been there. My daughter stood slowly, looking first at me and then at the door, with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Dad, this isn't normal." I nodded slowly, unable to hide my own unease. I knew I shouldn't, but I approached the door's new position and touched the handle. It was cold, colder than before, as if on the other side was a completely different environment. What disturbed me wasn't just the physical change, but what it meant. Places don't reconfigure themselves like this unless something is shaping reality according to its own logic. And when that happens, you're not just trapped in a space, you're trapped in the will of something that controls it. The hidden truth is that this kind of situation forces us to face a vulnerability we rarely admit, that we don't own the environment around us, even when we believe we do. My daughter moved away, sitting back on the bed, and I remained staring at that displaced door, as if it might, at any moment, return to its original position on its own. It didn't. The sound of the rain remained constant, but now it seemed to come from farther away, as if we had been moved, along with the room, to another part of the building. It was an absurd idea, and yet completely consistent with what we were experiencing. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are experiences that test more than just our courage. They shake our sense of space, time, and safety, and it's in this realm that true fear grows, the kind that can't be dispelled by turning on the lights or locking the doors. It settles in silently, gaining strength with small changes until it becomes impossible to tell exactly when it began. Comment there. That makes sense to me. I stood there, standing in front of that displaced door, trying to decide whether to turn the knob or pretend I hadn't noticed. The silence in the room had an almost physical weight, and the rain outside no longer stood out as much. It seemed muffled, distant, as if we'd been cut off from the rest of the world. So, without really thinking, I turned the key and opened it. The hallway was lit again, but there was something different about the light, a faint yellowish tint, as if the lamps were filtering the air, and it was at that moment that I saw him. At the far end of the hallway, motionless as a photograph forgotten in time, stood a man. He wore a threadbare cap, pulled low enough to obscure part of his face, and a heavy coat stained with dark stains that looked more than just mud. His shoulders were broad but slumped, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets as if he were in no hurry. His posture was strangely relaxed, but the way he stood, completely still, made the air around him seem colder. I glanced at my daughter quickly. She had seen it too, her eyes fixed on him, and I noticed the tension in her body, the way she gripped the edge of the bed tightly. I listened for any sound, the slightest sign of movement, but there was nothing. No creaking of the carpet, no sigh, no sound of breathing. And then, without time to react, I blinked. It was an involuntary, quick reflex, and when I opened my eyes, he was no longer at the end of the hallway. He was closer, much closer, maybe 5 meters away. He had the same posture, his hands still in his pockets, but now his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were analyzing me. The hallway behind him seemed narrower, and I had the strange sensation that the walls were slowly closing. My daughter took a deep breath, and that was the only sound that broke the moment. I wanted to close the door, but part of me couldn't move. It was as if looking at him kept me trapped, not out of physical fear, but out of a curiosity I didn't want to admit. Something about him didn't fit in the scene, as if he were out of place, not only in space, but in time itself. Blinking again was inevitable, and once again he was closer. Now I could see details. His scruffy beard, a few strands of hair escaping from under his cap, his coat with a rip near the zipper revealing darkened fabric. But what bothered me most was that, even so close, there was no sound coming from him. No footsteps to justify his approach. He was simply there. At that moment, I realized we were facing something that didn't follow the usual rules. And when the world around you stops following the rules you know, every decision you make carries a different weight. That's where the dilemma arises. Act on instinct and end the situation, or let curiosity win and see how far this can go. This mindset is dangerous because it transforms fear into a form of fascination. There are encounters that aren't limited to what's before our eyes. They carry an invisible impact, one that infiltrates our thoughts and begins to reshape the way we interpret space, time, and even ourselves. That figure in the hallway wasn't just a man standing still. It was a reminder that the presence of something can be more disturbing than any direct action, and that silence, when well sustained, can reveal truths that might be better left undiscovered. When I finally managed to move, it was as if an invisible weight had lifted from my shoulders. I grabbed my daughter's hand and pulled the door shut before I could even decide what to do next. My heart was still hammering in my chest, but I knew staying still wasn't an option. The feeling that we were being led towards something or away from something was suffocating. I took a deep breath, opened the door again, and this time he was gone. The hallway seemed empty, too quiet, as if nothing had happened. "Let's get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My daughter didn't question it. We ran down the hallway, the soles of our shoes muffled by the worn carpet, but the echo of our movement seemed to multiply, as if other footsteps were running alongside ours. We turned the first corner, and the sight before us slowed me down. It was the same hallway, same beige walls, same set of doors. I recognized the dark stain on the baseboard, the scratch on the corner of door 3's frame. It didn't make sense. We kept going, picking up speed again, and turned another corner. Again, the same hallway, the same stain, the same scratch, as if we were stuck in a physical loop. My daughter looked at me wide-eyed, and I didn't need to say anything for her to understand that I saw it too. We tried a third turn, then a fourth. Each time we changed direction, the feeling of familiarity grew, but there was something subtle that changed with each repetition, tiny shifts that made me wonder if they were coincidences or messages. It was then that I understood the door numbers. The first time I passed, I was sure they were correct, 1, 2, 3, 4, but now the order seemed jumbled. There was a door 2 followed by a door 2 again. Then a 5 turned upside down, as if the nail holding it had given way and the number had fallen off, becoming stuck upside down. Further, on a door with no number at all, just the faded mark where the metal had once been. It was as if the motel itself was rearranging its pieces as we moved. Normal logic dictated returning along the original path, but we were no longer certain which one. Each turn seemed to launch us into a section that mimicked the previous one, but with shifted details. The texture of the carpet changed subtly. Sometimes the floor creaked underfoot, other times it remained silent. It was as if we were traversing different versions of the same hallway, all coexisting at the same time. The air seemed warmer and more humid with each turn, as if we were circulating inside a closed, living space. And there was that smell, a mixture of mold, old dust, and something sweet, almost imperceptible, but which caused an uncomfortable sensation in the back of my throat. Worse still, with each turn, the lighting changed in intensity. Some lamps flickered, others were too bright, others had a stronger yellowish hue. This gave me the strange impression that we were passing through sections at different points in time, as if the corridor were not a single place, but several, overlapping. My daughter's grip tightened on my hand. We've been here before, but it wasn't like this before. She pointed to a door with the number 8 repeated twice, side by side, nailed together unevenly. I ran my fingers over the cool metal and noticed there were no visible screws, as if the numbers had been molded directly into the wood. A few feet ahead, a door with the number 4 had the number reversed, facing inward. It was impossible not to sense that these alterations weren't just maintenance errors, they seemed intentional. At every turn, I hoped to see the reception desk or some other familiar landmark, but everything repeated itself like a bad joke. My mind began to race, trying to find patterns, but at the same time fearing discovering they were there on purpose. It's like when you dream and realize you can't leave. A place, no matter which direction you choose, you end up back at the same spot. Only this time, it wasn't a dream, and there was no waking up. I started to wonder what might happen if we simply stopped walking. Would the hallway reorganize itself? Would something come to us? But standing there didn't seem any safer than continuing. It's strange how, in situations like this, we end up moving more by impulse than by reason. And maybe that's what the place wanted, to keep us moving, slowly eroding our perception of reality. Because when you lose your sense of direction, it's not just your body that becomes disoriented. Your mind begins to question everything, including your own memory. And when your memory is no longer reliable, any decision becomes a leap in the dark. It's at this point that we understand the impact of being in a place that shapes itself. It doesn't just want you to get physically lost. It wants you to doubt your own ability to recognize what's real. What bothered me most wasn't the fact that we were lost, but the certainty that space was playing tricks on us. There was no other plausible explanation. The corridor couldn't physically repeat itself like that unless we were inside something that didn't respect normal laws. We walked in silence, each turn a new hope of seeing the reception or a window overlooking the parking lot, but always the same sequence of doors and walls. Frustration began to mix with a heaviness in my chest, as if the air inside were denser, heavier, and I could already feel a slight tingling in my hands. Then, around another corner, we saw a different door. It was wider, painted a faded red, with a horizontal metal bar in the center and a barely legible sticker stuck to the corner, which, from its shape, still revealed the word exit. I knew it was unlikely it had been there all along. We'd passed so many similar hallways and nothing like it had ever appeared. I quickened my pace and my daughter followed me, clutching the arm of my jacket. I pushed hard on the bar and the door swung open, letting in a blast of cold, damp air that made me shiver. Before us, a metal fire escape stretched downward, surrounded by bare concrete walls stained by time and moisture. The sound of rain sounded closer now, dripping from somewhere we couldn't see. We descended quickly, step after step, our boots hitting the metal with a metallic echo that seemed to fade away far below. Every time I looked back, my daughter stared at me with that look that mixed fear and hope. Fear of what was yet to come, hope that we were finally getting out of there. The problem was that when we reached what appeared to be the ground floor, there was no exit. Instead of a door to the street, the stairs ended in another hallway, identical. Same wall color, same worn carpet, same flickering yellow lights. The only difference was that this hallway seemed quieter, as if absorbing any sound we made. Even our footsteps, previously audible, now sounded muffled, almost unreal. We stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure it out. My daughter began looking around with growing nervousness, as if searching for something she didn't want to find. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "I smell wet earth." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. "Like when it rains?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, like in a cemetery." Those words cut through me like a cold blade. The smell was there. I just hadn't paid attention until she mentioned it. It was a sweet, damp odor that seeped into my nostrils and clung to the back of my throat, awakening an almost instinctive sense of discomfort. It was the kind of smell that comes not just from a physical place, but from something laden with memories and stories that prefer to remain buried. I glanced down the hallway and noticed the lighting seemed dimmer, even with the lamps on. Shadows stretched across the walls, stretching until they touched the ceiling, creating strange angles, as if the lights were stuck in a constant cycle of flickering. I felt the urgent need to get out of there, but every fiber of my being also knew that, whatever direction we chose, the place had a way of bringing us back to the same point. I gripped her hand tighter and said, "Let's keep going straight, don't look back." I don't know where I got that order, but it felt right. We walked quickly, and the further we went, the stronger the smell grew. It was as if, instead of moving away from its source, we were moving closer. My steps began to grow heavier, and the air seemed more humid, almost sticky. I felt beads of cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck, even though my body was freezing. The hallway ran straight for a few meters and then curved. I took a deep breath before turning the corner, but when I did, frustration and fear mingled. It was the same stretch we'd just come from, the same doors, the same lamp with the cracked glass in the corner, the same feeling of being watched from a point we couldn't quite place. My daughter stopped suddenly and began to cry softly, squeezing my fingers tightly. It wasn't a desperate cry, but the kind of suppressed cry that seems to come more from within than from the eyes. "I don't want to stay here, Dad. This place doesn't want us to leave." Her words were simple, but they carried a truth I couldn't ignore. There was something about the motel, something that controlled more than the walls and hallways. It was as if we were inside a will that reveled in testing us, making us feel small, out of place, vulnerable. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to think. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a new sound. It wasn't the rain, nor our footsteps, nor the electric vibration of the lamps. It was something deeper, a low, almost subterranean rumble, like the sound of earth being disturbed. The smell grew more intense, and the chill in my hands spread up my arms. I knew that somehow the sound was connected to the smell, and that it meant we weren't just trapped, but perhaps approaching the core of whatever kept this place as it was. Because there are times when the feeling of imprisonment comes not from the walls that surround you, but from the understanding that you've entered a territory not made for visitors. And when that territory begins to shape the path beneath your feet, the challenge stops being simply finding the exit. It becomes understanding whether you can still trust the ground you walk on. I couldn't. Remember how long we'd walked in that basement that opened into identical corridors. But something, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps an ancient survival instinct, pushed me to a simple decision: return to the point where our memory still worked. If the place wanted to confuse us, I needed to reduce the variables. I squeezed my daughter's hand and said we would count the doors quietly, from the next corner to the first cracked light bulb I remembered seeing. She nodded, wiped away the tears we hadn't noticed when they began with her fist, and took a deep breath, as if accepting a silent agreement with her own fear. We walked together, guided more by pact than by our senses. 1, 2, 3. The cracked light bulb appeared on the ceiling like a tired beacon. That gave us a little courage. To the left, a bend. To the right, another. Repetition. We repeated the method, and it was then that we noticed a detail hidden in the monotony. The shadow of a painted sign on the baseboard, almost faded by. Time, a spray-painted arrow pointing to nothing. Whether it was a maintenance mark, a mistake, or a trace of someone who had tried to leave before, I don't know, but we continued. The arrow led us to a curve we didn't remember. For a second, cooler air blew from the end of the hallway, a barely perceptible freshness, as if a distant window had been opened. We sped up, and as we rounded that last corner, time seemed to untie its knot. The door was there, the number 7, crooked but recognizable, hanging by a worn screw. I knew it before I read it. The body recognizes the return home long before the brain. I leaned my forehead against the wood for a moment, as if it could restore some balance I'd lost. "This is it," I said, and only when I heard my own voice did I realize how hoarse it was. I turned the key. The click of the bolt was louder than it should have been. The handle gave, and I pushed the door open slowly, like someone entering a hospital room after bad news. What we saw wasn't comfort. It wasn't safety. It was our room, and yet at the same time it wasn't. The suitcase we'd left closed, leaning against the wall, was now open, its lid gaping like a surprised mouth. The clothes I'd folded on top were disturbed, not thrown, but turned over by methodical hands. The television, which I remembered turning off, emitted the bluish light of a dead channel, a sea of static that leaked a faint, insistent background noise. The sound seemed to ooze from within. The set, like water seeping through a hollow wall. The chair had shifted, its back was turned toward the window, as if someone had sat there for a long time, watching the neon sign pulse into the glass. The curtains, previously closed, now left a gap that cut the darkness of the room in a crimson strip, breathing in the rhythm of the rain. I began to silently check. Wallet, cell phone, documents. Nothing seemed missing. It wasn't theft, it was curation, a rearrangement. My daughter stood near the bed, looking at her sneakers, until she asked without negotiating with her own voice, "Is anyone here with us?" I answered no. The answer came automatically, trained by the part of my mind that tries to protect. But the truth is, her question wasn't about physical presence. It was about something else, deeper, denser. There was company in that room, even if it didn't take up space. I walked over to the television and pressed the button on the panel. The screen flickered, darkened, came back, on, and then went back to noise. I turned the volume down. The static continued to whisper, as if the sound had moved into the walls. I unplugged it. The light died, but the sensation of noise lingered in the air, a nervous buzzing that seemed to vibrate beneath my skin. Beside the set, in the old restaurant brochure, there was a new fold, a sharp crease in the paper that hadn't been there before. I opened the guide, flipped through it impulsively, and found, in the middle, a barely visible, washed-out ink note. "Don't look at the door." The letters trembled, some touching the edge of the page and crumbling, as if the ink had been diluted by the humidity in the room. I showed it to my daughter without saying anything. She bit her lip and looked away. I felt the same urge. It was then that I noticed another subtle change. The clock, the one with the large numbers, 2 hours behind, now showed an impossible time. 12:07. I looked at my phone. 2:07, exactly 2 hours ahead. The clock hadn't been corrected. It had advanced on its own until it aligned with something only it obeyed. The second hand remained steady, disciplined, as if nothing were wrong. There are revelations that weaken the legs, not for what they reveal, but for what they overturn from silent convictions. The certainty that time outside governs time inside. In that place, the rules were backstage, and backstage doesn't respond to the stage. I sat on the edge of the bed and held out my hand to my daughter. I told her we would be together, that the night would pass, that every night passes. She nodded in disbelief, just as I did. We closed the door and left the bathroom light on, as if that rectangle of brightness could watch over the greater darkness. We lay down without taking off our sneakers. A distant flash of lightning flickered through the crack and made the shadow of the chair tremble on the floor. The static returned for a second, even with the TV unplugged, and then stopped. The bed creaked as I breathed deeper, and the heater every few minutes coughed out a warm breath. I wanted to pray, but my thoughts couldn't find the words, so I clung to something else, the petty discipline of small decisions, counting breaths, lengthening exhalations, listening to the sounds that exist before fear glues everyone to the same mask. The night, in its factory-like mechanics, wore on. At some point, I think we both fell asleep, or fell into that state where the mind blanks out for Seconds and returns before the body realizes. I dreamed I was walking down a dirt corridor with exposed roots in the corners, and that each root had a number pinned to it, and that when I touched the number, it turned inward, escaping from my hand. I woke with the feeling I had said my daughter's name out loud. She was asleep, staring at the wall, but I knew she was awake. There's a particular way of breathing when you pretend to sleep so as not to scare the other. I don't know what time it was. When I realized the rain had stopped, silence came first, and behind it a timid light. No neon, no electric flash, no red pulses. It was a pale brightness of a day in the making. I got up slowly, my back complaining from the tired mattress, and went to the window. The sky was that clear grey of a morning after a storm. The wet parking lot reflected a piece of that sky. The sedan with its fogged windows was gone. In its place, puddles. No footprints, no fresh tire tracks, just the sheen of sheets of water. My daughter sat up in bed, her eyes squinting against the light. I asked her how she was. She responded with a fine that had yet to learn to be true. "Let's go," I said. And the words weren't a question. I packed my things in my suitcase with the haste required for someone who doesn't want to give the place time to decide for us. I checked the brochure, as if the inked warning might have faded. It was still there, more washed out, but there. At the door, I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The bolt didn't click, it slid. We opened it. The hallway before us was short and straight, a perfect rectangle of worn carpet, a clean line of white lamps, the wall without curves, without folds, without repetitions. I counted the doors out of habit, and they followed the obvious, regular, comfortable order. 5 steps to the right, and the reception desk was already staring at us with that yellowed lampshade that in the morning seemed less tired. I turned my head, reflexively, toward room 7. Everything seemed normal to the point of offending. My mind tried for a few seconds to fit the entire evening into the simple layout of that hallway. It was as if someone had reset the scenery, arranged the chairs, wiped the stage, and reset the clock to social time. Hidden truth, however, cannot be wiped away. It lingers in the scent and in the memory, in that spot behind the eyes where transformation needs no proof to exist. The receptionist greeted us with a curt nod. His face in the daylight looked younger, as if the night's fatigue were a professional mask. I wanted to tell him something, anything that sounded like a story, but the words refused to form sentences that made sense outside the storm. He asked if the stay was okay. I said yes, and I hated the word the moment it came out. Okay is a polish we apply over what we can't name. He handed me a receipt with a crooked stamp, like all stamps in this world, and wished me a safe trip. On Route 66, which felt almost like an ancient blessing, we left. In the parking lot, the air smelled of washed asphalt. The sky was beginning to open on the horizon, leaving a faded blue strip in the east. I put my bag in the back seat, and my daughter got in and closed the door slowly, as if she could still hear the static somewhere deep in her head. When I started the engine responded immediately. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the marquee of the Silver Pine Motel, silhouetted against the morning. The sign was faded. For a moment, I imagined the figure of the man in the cap standing in a doorway, hands in his pockets, just existing. But there was no one. Just 2 pigeons fighting over invisible crumbs near the drain. I drove to the exit and stopped for a second, with my turn signal on, waiting for a truck to pass on the highway. The turn signal made its own little ticking clock, ticking, 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 and I realized my body had resynchronized with the ordinary signals of the normal world. Still, some part of me knew it wasn't over. Places like these don't end because the sun comes out. They simply retreat, like nocturnal creatures, and resume their routine when the shadows grow on the walls again. The journey continues with what we carry, and the impact of what we experience doesn't depend on whether you tell us or keep quiet. It has already done what it needed to do within you. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the mind when it goes through a night like this, learns to distrust the maps that once seemed definitive. It's a change of mindset that can't be measured in big words, but in small gestures, tiny decisions, looking twice at a door, listening to the silence as if it were saying something, respecting one's own limits without feeling ashamed. It's not about heroism, it's about integrity, about choosing to carry on even when the world for a few hours has decided to be different. Perhaps this is the revelation that places like the Silver Pine Motel extract from us. You don't control the hallway, but you can decide how to walk it. And above all, what you won't leave behind when it seems bigger than it is. Comment there. That makes sense to me. As the road opened up before us, and the Silver Pine Motel became just a distant speck in the rearview mirror, my mind began to do what it always does when something defies logic. Try to rearrange fantasies, find explanations that fit the comfortable mold of what's possible. I found myself thinking about the rain, the fatigue accumulated after hours of driving, the tense silence that had existed between my daughter and me before that night. Perhaps it had all been a result of this, a delirium shaped by fatigue, by suggestion, and by the silent fear that unfamiliar environments can evoke. Perhaps the hallway had never changed location. Perhaps the man in the cap had never existed, except in the overlapping of our frightened gazes. But there was something that prevented this theory from fully taking hold. It wasn't just the memory of the doors with the wrong numbers or the missing soda machine. It was the concrete, physical sensation of being inside a place that not only contained us, but molded us according to its will. Sensations like these can't be dispelled by rational arguments. They take root somewhere between the body and memory, a place where the certainties of the outside world cannot penetrate. My daughter didn't say much during the ride, but I could tell from her gestures that she was also carrying something. She was more careful when looking through the window, a watchful silence that wasn't typical for her. Perhaps she, too, was trying to decide which version of the night to believe. I didn't pressure her. Some experiences are so intimate that not even those who live together can share them completely. As I drove, I thought about how the human mind searches for answers, even when it knows they may never come. It's a need to fill empty spaces, to give form to what eludes us. But that night, I had the impression that the void didn't want to be filled. It wanted to remain empty. Perhaps this is the most uncomfortable hidden truth. Some things exist only to remain in the shadows, and trying to illuminate them risks forever changing the way we see the rest of the world. The following days brought new sights, new sounds, and everyday life crept back into our lives as it always does. But that didn't make the memory of the motel lose its power. On the contrary, it remained alive in a way that ordinary experiences cannot. And that's where the doubt remains. Corrosive, demanding attention. Was it real, or was it a distorted reflection of what we carried inside? A mental trap born of exhaustion and isolation? I don't know. I may never know. But there's one thing I can't shake, no matter how much time passes. But to this day, when I close my eyes, I still see that man at the end of the hallway. If you've made it this far, you already know that what we experienced that night at the Silver Pine Motel can't be captured in words. It's the kind of story that changes how you view seemingly ordinary places, and perhaps even how you trust your own memory. That's why I keep sharing these stories, so that each of us has, at the very least, an emotional map to recognize when something isn't as it should be. So, if this experience resonated with you, if it somehow kept you hooked until the very last. Second, leave a comment below. I'm with you until the end. It's the best way for me to know who truly walks with me until the final pages of each story. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next real-life story, which is ready to go. And I guarantee it will take you down paths just as disturbing. And of course, leave your like now. It's a simple gesture, but it keeps alive the connection we built throughout the video. Next time, I'll tell you about another, place that has more questions than answers, and that perhaps you'd rather not visit alone.